Hello, my name is Tom Helmer. I'm with the Hopkinton Historical Association, and today I'm going to be your guide to Manitou Hassannash Preserve. What we're going to do is walk the trail, the high trail, and then come into the wander zone. Hopefully you will enjoy this trip and the narration. Alright, I'm speaking to you from the junction of the high trail, which will be behind me, and the low trail, which will be going off that way. You'll see these pink trail markers. For CSL Day, the trail will be marked, but after CSL, the trail markers are going down and the ferns and bullbriars are going back so that this trail will not be obvious next year. Now, Manitou Hassannash Preserve got its name from the Algonquin word spiritual stone grouping. It is a custom of the indigenous people all across North America and on up into Canada, and for all I know all over the world, but certainly in North America, as part of their theology. Individuals would place stones, such as what you see here. Many times they're on top of a larger base rock, and as they would place each stone, they would say a prayer into the stone. And many of those prayers were a request for harmony with Nukasaki. 2 words, Nukasaki. That's Mother Earth, one of the major spirits in indigenous theology. Nukasaki was the creator of all things. She was one of 2 primary spirits. The other one was Katantowitz. Nukasaki made all things. Katantowitz lived in the southwest, over that away. And when you died, you went to live with Katantowitz. But among other beneficial things Katantowitz did was he gave to the indigenous people corn and beans, which were staple crops for them. So all through Manitou Hassannash Preserve, we are going to see these curious piles of rocks. And there's great meaning behind these rocks, particularly for the indigenous people. If you leave them be, the prayers, and who knows how long those prayers have been active, but those prayers remain active. If you disturb the rocks in a Manitou Hassannash, even if you put the rock back exactly where it was, the prayers are disabled, which is why when you're in this area, and where we're going is the equivalent of a cathedral in Christendom's religion. This is sacred ground. So act with respect, act accordingly. So what we're going to do now is we're going to continue on up the high trail and see what we find. We're just 50 feet from the junction of the high trail, which we're taking, and the low trail. And already there are 3 Manitou Hassannash right in line with the trail. And we're going to zoom in on each of the 3. You can see the pile of boulders, well, you can see the pile of rocks sandwiched between two larger rocks forming a sort of inverted V. In this one, there we go. You can see a large boulder with a base surrounding it with smaller rocks, and atop it is another rock. Now we'll move over to the third one, which is in shadow over here, and there it is. You'll have to excuse my cinematography. These are my first few days with this camera. Going on in. And we have a... Alright, let's go back on out. Pardon my ineptness. And on this one, we have a very large boulder with a pile of smaller rocks atop it that blends back over to the left into the hillside. This is the cemetery of Thomas Brightman. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He lived to 93 and he died in the early 1800s. You'll find more detailed information about this cemetery, the Brightman lot, and others in Hopkinton in Laurie, Aruda, and Gail Waite's book, The Historic Cemeteries of Hopkinton, Rhode Island. This cemetery illustrates the theology of Christendom prior to around the 1850s and 1860s. If you were a good person, at that time they believed that the resurrection would come from the east traveling to the west. Now right now it's 11:30, something like that. East is behind me. West is that away. The bodies were buried with their feet that way, and their head would be on the opposite side of the stone. So that when you read the stone, you were not standing on the body. That's modern practice. In those days, you stood not on the body. And when the resurrection came, according to Christendom theology, it would come from the east, and those in the memorial tombs would hear Christ's voice and come on out. So if you were a good person with your feet buried to the east and your head buried to the west, when you sat up in the grave, you would be facing the resurrection. If you were a bad person, they buried you north-south. Everyone would know, okay, if they saw a grave or line north-south, they would know this was not a good person, so we don't particularly care about them. But if you're east-west, you were a good person. And not every marker in here has a name. But this was a family graveyard. And you didn't need a name. You knew where Thomas was, where his wife was buried, where his son was buried, where their servant was buried, where Uncle Harry was buried. You didn't need a name on the stone because you grew up knowing these things about your family. Times change. People moved west. Many family graveyards were abandoned. A lot of names were lost. They're lost to us, but in Christendom's theology, they're not lost to God. Anyhow, Brightman Cemetery. Manitou Hassannash Preserve preserves more than just the indigenous features. It preserves the mix of colonial and later settlers with the indigenous people. And that makes it an extremely interesting place to have preserved by the Hopkinton Land Trust. This is the start of a wall that was probably built by the colonial Tom Brightman for his use in whatever he would do for farming purposes. It runs straight for a very long way. There's occasional gaps way far away, perhaps a quarter mile away. There was a road down in a valley. The wall doesn't make it that far. But this wall, in about 100 yards that way, where there's a gap, has been repurposed at a later date by the indigenous people, turning it into a snake wall by the location and placement of one rock on the far end, which we will see. This is an interesting mix of settler and indigenous people overlapping on the same land, and is one of the things that is unique about Manitou Hassannash Preserve. It's covered in great detail in the book Land of 1,000 Cairns by James and Mary Gage. Anyhow, more on the snake wall when we get to it. The trail passes between two Manitou Hassannash. This one, which would be on your left as you're coming up the hill, possibly is a turtle effigy. The turtle was the symbol of Nukasaki, Mother Earth, the creator of everything. And frequently there are turtle effigies found not only in Hopkinton, but also in your town out in the woods. And the turtle effigy has a couple of features that are fairly typical. There will be a head, and there will be two front flippers. Now, we can't show you the back one because it's on the other side. Hey, ain't physics grand. The problem with seeing turtles is once you see your first one, then you see them everywhere. You get turtle fever and everything becomes a turtle. Well, calm down. A real turtle, first off, that area of understanding what is a ceremonial stone landscape, a CSL, is not yours to decide. That is a decision made by members of a historically recognized tribe. But we can come up with good guesses, and this is possibly a symbol of Nukasaki. We're going to shift over to the partner, and I'm going to do that one handheld because it contains another feature that you more than likely will find in your woods, and you'll certainly find here in Hopkinton. Okay, over here in the center of the field is the possible turtle effigy that I spoke about. But I'm going to walk over to its partner to the right of the path and show you this other feature that is of significance in the indigenous view of matters. My finger, no, here it is. My finger is touching a piece of quartz. Hopefully we'll focus in on that. Everybody likes shiny stuff. You probably have gold jewelry. But the indigenous people of most of North America did not have gold. But what they did have was quartz. Quartz is shiny. Quartz is like captured moonlight. Quartz was a symbol of honor. And not all Manitou Hassannash, but many will have one or more pieces of quartz in the top, somewheres in that rock pile, as a symbol denoting honor. When you're out in the woods, look for them, but don't disturb the rocks. You can pull leaves off and stuff like that, light stuff, but don't mess up the rocks because you'll be interfering with prayers that have been in existence for hundreds, if not 1,000 or more years. I'd like to call your attention to that yellow sign that's on a tree 18 feet away. I'm going to zoom in so you can read the very important information on that sign. Hopefully you're not getting sick. Hopkinton Land Trust, property boundary, private property beyond this sign. You're in Hopkinton. People take their property very seriously here. Do not go past those yellow signs which mark the perimeter of the land owned by the Hopkinton Land Trust. You've been warned. This is the end of that wall that we showed you over by the Thomas Brightman Cemetery. The rock before me has been propped up, and as I zoom closer in, you can make out the wall through the summer growth. This rock is interesting in that it contains drill holes. The indigenous people at first did not know about iron tools. Along the bottom edge, and I will zoom in on that, you can see the sunlight illuminating two drill holes. This is done with the feathers and wedge method using iron tools. This is an indication in James and Mary Gage's book that when that stone was propped up, it was well after the period of first contact between Europeans and indigenous people. And the theory of James and Mary Gage is that the indigenous spiritual practices, which were way out of favor following King Philip's War in the 1680s, 70s, 80s, somewhere like that. If you've never Googled it, you ought to, because you won't understand indigenous history without knowledge of King Philip's War. Anyhow, the spirit practices of the indigenous people were kind of driven underground. But here, on Brightman Hill in Manitou Hassannash Preserve, there is evidence of a spiritual revival of the Narragansett practices, which is the subject and the theory of James and Mary Gage's book, Land of 1,000 Cairns, which you can find on all lowercase stonestructures.org. One of the ways that these Manitou Hassannash endure through time is what they're built on. That is a serious boulder. It's probably a glacial erratic in Hopkinton. You know you're in Hopkinton because if you try and dig a hole 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet deep, you'll end up with 85 cubic feet of rock coming out of that same hole. You can't fit it all back in. But this is on a solid foundation, and that's on a solid foundation. They endure for an incredible period of time. Now here, in the controversial theory of James and Mary Gage, these may be relatively modern constructions from the 1850s, but there are other places in Hopkinton where they may be 1,000 years old, maybe longer. We have no way of telling. But the ones that endure are on good solid foundations. Alright, I'm going handheld and sweeping the area. There are a number of Manitou Hassannash up here, and we're on the edge of a crest of a hill. We'll go below in a little bit, but there was a road down there, and I'm going to have to step back to get this guy in. Sorry for the shakes. Behind me, or ahead of us, there is another, and then over here, and I'm going to back up. The structure continues. It's a very dense field, and you can see in the background even more further away. But again, this is nothing compared to what you're going to see in the wander zone. Again, we see not one but two boundary warning signs on this portion of the trail. And the reason for that is that's somebody's backyard. That's the second warning. Stay on your side of the boundary. Alright, this Manitou Hassannash is a split boulder. You'll see that the portion lying flat on the ground actually lines up with a portion of the main rock, and you can see the cleavage lines in the fissures in the main rock with the numerous other stones piled on the portion that's lying down. Split rocks represented significance in the indigenous view of the world. And this rock, more so than most, in that triangular opening. And let's adjust this and get in even closer. That triangular opening, complete with a spider web, according to Mary Gage in her research, represents a portal. In indigenous theology, there were spirits in the sky, spirits on the land, in the land, in the trees, in the plants, in the animals, in the people, and there were spirits under the ground. And you would make an occasional gift of something that was important to you. Not a lot, but a pinch of tobacco, a few seeds of corn. It had to be valuable to you It was not a monetary thing. It was what you valued as your gift to these various spirits. Things like split rocks, things like this, they were considered portals between the spirits below the ground to the spirits in other regions. And they're highly significant. The trail runs between these two Manitou Hassannash, but what I want to talk about now are those two little orange flags at the base of each one of the Manitou Hassannash. They represent the work of the researchers, the researching team of Steve DiMarzo and Todd Carden. They identified, GPS'd, and working with James Gage, registered with the state of Rhode Island over 1,000 Manitou Hassannash on the property of Manitou Hassannash Preserve. So each of these yellow or orange flags says Steve DiMarzo and Todd Carden were here. And oh, by the way, they were here when there was no trail. They bushwhacked their way through all of this. Tom Brightman and the early settlers in this area, they had a sawmill, they had a cider mill, they used the Canachet Brook power to run all sorts of things, but they had roads. And what you're looking at, and what I will pan to, is the remains of one of these colonial settler roads. And it's right now, it's in the center of the field going off to the left. And I'm going to swing around to the left, staying on the road and picking it up as it goes downhill, and then we'll turn to the left. But these old roads still leave traces behind. And this is how they got from A to B. Now I'm going to try and walk down this road, and excuse me if you throw up. But here we are hiking down in a valley, a little swale, following this old road. And look, coming up, you can see where it continues its turn to the left and goes down the hill. And as soon as I get steady, I'm going to telescope in on that. They split, the road turned, because they didn't want to try and move that great big rock to the right center. So they went to the left center, over the hill and down. When your eye gets trained to see things in the forest, the landscape opens up. But first you need somebody to teach you to see the Narragansett, to see the difference between them and a farmer pile, to see the subtle traces of the old road, although this is not a subtle trace. This is like Route 95. The trail again runs through directly between two Manitou Hassannash. And we are approaching the crest of the hill that will lead down to the actual Canachet Brook Valley. As you can see, we're right on the edge of the crest, and it's a fairly steep drop-off down below, straight ahead. But the way that we're going is along the crest of the ridge, through there. Later on, although not too far from now, we're going to drop down into the valley, into the middle of the wander zone. Quartz doesn't have to be on top of things. There and there, quartz. But if we back up, we see that they're on another portion, and if we back up even further manually, sorry for the dizzy, maybe I've got turtle fever, but that's a wonderful turtle head. You can see the left foreleg and the right foreleg. Between the left foreleg and the turtle head, there is a niche, and that would be where you would place your little pinch of whatever you considered valuable as an offering to Nukasaki. This Manitou Hassannash gets photographed a lot, but from the photograph you won't see the quartz. So one of the rules you got to do is look at something. You got to look at it close. You got to look at it from all the way around, because here is quartz, 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 there is quartz. That's a lot of quartz. Whatever is symbolized by this Manitou Hassannash, it was something worthy of great respect by the indigenous people. Should be for you as well. One of the qualities that marks many of the Manitou Hassannash in Manitou Hassannash Preserve is the original people built these with a superb sense of balance. That is illustrated in this Manitou Hassannash as we zoom in. So they built a house of cards out of stone, and it has endured for, at a minimum, 150 years. Again, however, it's built on a stable platform, a seriously large boulder on the other side. On that same theme of balance, look at this stone. Now, James and Mary Gage and Steve and DeMarzo and Todd Carden have a special name for this, but I only have so much room in my head, so I don't know. It's got a special name, but when we zoom in, that didn't happen by accident. Even the little stone to the right is propped up in the air. On this Manitou Hassannash, we have a very large base. We have a mix of big stones along the crest as well, and smaller stones in the interior. That did not happen by accident. These things were deliberately constructed this way for a purpose that is beyond my knowledge, joining a very large crowd of things that are beyond my knowledge. But the reason that I'm pointing this out to you, giant stones, big stones, medium stones, small stones, is you have to learn to see these things, not just say, oh, a pile of rocks. It was built for a purpose, specific purpose. And you have to learn to see these differences. I've shown you a couple of stones, cairns, Manitou Hassannash. We don't have a language police. Call them what you will. But those are very subtle things, these things that are balanced. The quartz, that's part of the construction. You have to learn to see these things. And how do you learn to see it? By going out in the woods and looking for it. But right now, I'm taking the place of Bob Miner and teaching you to see these things by showing them to you in this video. You'll find them. Sooner or later, you'll find them in your woods. But you got to go out and feed the bugs to find them. And you got to walk around them. Because the side that you come upon may not have the extraordinary feature in it. Bob Miner taught me that. I'm telling you. It's good advice. This rock formation, we're approaching this from the, oh, I don't know, I guess it's the east-southeast. That's your landmark for when you turn down into the wander zone. Going to get in closer. It has its own special characteristics. It may be possible that that big rock was manipulated, the big rock on the right, to sit against the ledge rock on the left. Who knows? I certainly couldn't move it, but there are things that get moved around that defy the lack of hydraulic equipment. Some things remain with the indigenous people as to how they were done. Anyhow, this feature looks like this from the side, but the next shot is going to show you that from below, we call it the shark rock. You may recognize this from your program. If you were at CSL Day, it's the cover photo. There's the shark rock coming out of the ground, and in front of it is another small wall. Oh, let me go up there. This is a space, 2 feet wide. No matter how hard I push, it ain't moving. I guess it wants to be here. And this is all one piece. You can see the layers that have been cracked off. And now we are entering the wander zone. As I pan the camera, some of the Manitou Hassannash will be apparent to you. Others, you have to wander around to see them. But when I'm in a normal, dense cairn field, I can pick up a pebble and throw it and hit the next Manitou Hassannash. Here, I can take my hat and throw it over this cairn and hit the next one. You can't toss a hat very far, but up here you're never more than a hat toss away from the next one. They tell me, James and Mary Gage have recorded all of this locations on their map that Steve DeMarzo and Todd Carden sent them the GPS information for. And the Wander Zone may be the densest cairn field, Manitou Hassannash field. Remember, there's no language police. It may be the densest field in all of Rhode Island. And there's so many that we don't have a trail here. You wander around and take a look. In the Wander Zone, I'm shifting over to Tourista handheld cameras. This is what remains of what we called the cantilevered cairn. On that rock with 3 steps, that was suspended in the air by a very clever arrangement of weights and levers, with a rock roughly the size of a bowling ball, maybe a little smaller, sitting on the end of that 3-tiered rock. But the tree branch that you see fell down and hit this thing right square on the head last June. And since that time, a couple of weeks ago, the balance rock, the rock suspended in air, was still on the cantilevered cairn, but now I see where it has rolled over, and is the round rock in the center of the field right now. We were faced with a dilemma when we discovered this. Do we take the branch off? And that branch has to weigh several hundred pounds. Do we try and restore the cantilevered cairn to its original balance? But what Rick Prescott, Harvey Buford, and I decided was that Nukasaki saw this thing built, and Nukasaki said its purpose has been achieved. The picture of the cantilevered cairn was vital in getting the planning board to not approve this land for subdivision and to come out and see for themselves. And they saw the ingenuity of the cantilevered cairn, and they started the site on its road to preservation. Well, the site's well on its way. Cantilevered cairn did its job. Nukasaki wants it back. It's fine with us. Try not to mess with things. Let nature, Nukasaki, take its course in your area of the woods. And oh, by the way, while I'm sitting here blathering, you're seeing all sorts of other balanced rocks in the background here. So I'm going to wander around in the Wander Zone and show you some more. A sense of balance was not confined to the cantilevered cairn. This cairn is only 15 feet away from it. And again, that's some tricky balancing. Everything I'm showing you is within 25 feet of the cantilevered cairn, which reminds me, the cantilevered cairn is the one that's underneath the tree branch in the background, which reminds me I have to go find out where my hat ended up. All of this stuff was what Astrid Muir said to me January 1st, 2014. There's something fascinating I want to show you. And we finally got out here at the end of March, and it was jaw-dropping. She led us right to this place, Bob Miner and myself, and we were astounded by what we saw, the density of what we saw, and all in all, it was beyond anything that we had experienced before. I'm going to zoom in on this guy. Again, the sense of balance. Even if this is, we go from James and Mary Gage's theory of the earliest or the most recent construction, that's 150 years that's been sitting there. Maybe longer. Over here, more. Down here right next to me. Another tricky balance, although we've seen this from a different angle. More. Look at this guy, it's got like a cherry on the top of it. When you go through the wander zone, there it is. Be prepared. It's like nothing that I've ever seen before. Maybe you've seen denser, but I haven't. Even the bugs come to see the wander zone. This guy's taking the express route. He's looking around. Hey, that's amazing. Uh-oh. By the way, you got to watch your step when you're out here in the woods. And this guy, regular feet and pseudopods, is paying good attention to it. So I found my hat. That's no ordinary hat. That's a Friends of the Hopkinton Land Trust hat. And they don't grow on trees. For a $10,000 donation, the Friends of the Hopkinton Land Trust will send you several hats. I can't help it. I crack myself up. More balance. More cairns. Foreground, middle, background. Down over here. Cairns all the way down to the bottom of the hill. That structure over there. You really gotta be here. But this is the next best thing. Again, the big solid base. We got this little guy right here. Down that way. We got another structure. Right over here. A whole bunch just in the same frame. This little is big boulder with a little guy taking a piggyback ride, and behind it more stuff in the background. Here is another rock with stuff taking a piggyback ride on the slope, and you can see how it's propped up down at the base on the left. This has got a bit of everything. Big rocks balanced on the top, little rocks on the slope. Another view of another portion of the cairn field. Everywhere you look in this frame, there are Manitou Hassannash. This cairn with a tunnel through it is the next door neighbor to the cantilevered cairn. I'm going to swing over. And there is the branch that did in the cantilevered cairn. More balancing rocks. And in the background. And that does it for my battery.